Right, welcome back everyone to Information Revolution, a podcast about information, how we work with it, what's changing in the industry, and what might need to change. I'm very excited to report that we've got our first guest on the podcast today. We have Gillian Oliver. Welcome, Gillian. And before we jump into this, I'll just start with the topic. So, we thought it would be really useful to have Gillian on to talk about information culture. So, in the last few episodes, we've been talking about the people stuff, as we called it. So, we thought information culture sounds like a great aspect of that. So, we'll kick off just with the usual introductions. My name's Michael Upton. I'm an information management consultant based in Wellington, New Zealand, and I'm a director of a company called Metataxis New Zealand.
And I'm Judi Vernau. I'm an information architect, and I'm also work for Metataxis New Zealand, and I've been doing information architecture for longer than I care to remember, and I'm very interested to know what Gillian thinks about how that intersects with some of the things we'll be talking about today. So, Gillian, would you like to just introduce yourself?
Yes, so first of all, hello, Michael and Judi, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me on. So I'm an academic, an associate professor at Monash University based in Melbourne.
And I wanted to ask a question right off the bat, because I know that in Australia you talk about record keeping, and I think when we were discussing this before with Karl, we were talking about record keeping culture. And I just wanted to ask you, particularly since I know you're a Brit originally, whether you see any difference between record keeping and information management, or are they the same for you?
Talk about, I thought you'd start off with an easy question, not a difficult question.
Judi.
I tend to use the language that means most to whoever it is I'm talking to.
Absolutely.
So in a lot of circumstances, I will talk about information management. But at Monash, the university I'm from, that's the home of the records continuum. So the language there is very much record keeping as one word without a hyphen.
Oh, interesting. So, right.
That's an important point. And with our latest book, so the book I've written with Fiorella Foscarini about information culture, we actually called it, the second edition, Record Keeping Culture, to just sort of emphasize that what we were aiming to do was to sort of explore information cultures, but specifically in the context of record keeping, with a view to promoting a sound record-keeping culture.
Do you think that, just talking about how people respond to the idea of record-keeping, do you think that in an organisation, record-keeping ought to be, as it were, invisible to the average person in the organisation, or do you think everybody needs to be aware of and involved in record-keeping?
I think everybody is involved in record keeping.
Yes, whether they want to or not, I guess.
Yeah, the extent to which they need to be aware of it really varies according to the culture. So if, with all these things, the way I'd respond would depend on the context, but I don't think that it is necessarily essential for everybody, if it's not going to work, to be aware of record keeping per se. If it has to be invisible, so long as it's, the objectives are being achieved, I think that's fine.
So can you think of some examples of, you don't have to name names, but just examples of really good record keeping cultures?
Difficult ones, problematic ones.
Yes. yeah, we always remember those ones.
I think, the good ones are where objectives are being achieved, and so it might not be so obvious that that is a excellent record keeping culture, because you've achieved the desired outcome and everything's functioning and running smoothly.
Yeah, I think we've said that before, haven't we, Michael? That when it's working, you don't see it. It's the same as I say about information architecture.
Yeah.
Nobody out there should need to know about that.
No.
It should just be really helping them to do their job.
Yes.
Mm. And I think we talk about it as a feature of design as well, that, I always bang on about potato peelers as an example of good design because it's
Do you?
completely because it's completely unsexy. It's not a sort of high-end brand kind of idea of design, but it is exactly the kind of thing that if a potato peeler is not working, you know all about it. But
Yes.
it's
Yes.
there's some sense in which when something's working, it is invisible because you can take it for granted because it's so lacking in kind of friction or something, Yeah, yeah. So I'm curious, and Gillian, whether you have sort of thoughts on um, the factors that contribute to a good culture, I suppose, in terms of records.
I think the key ideas behind our work on information culture is really understanding the layers of cultural influences in organisations and how they influence people's interactions with records, with information. So a key factor for me is for the information professionals, the records managers, the record keepers, whatever you want to call them, having that insight and that sensitivity to the ways in which people work, and sort of rather than trying to come in and impose a best practice solution, but to sort of figure out what these layers of influences are, and then to use that insight to be able to, even if it's just promote particular solutions. Say the information architecture will facilitate sharing of information across the organisation, just some really simplistic example. But you've got a team, a department where individuals are rewarded on their solo performance. So they're guarding their information.
Yeah.
So if you're promoting it based on, hey, you've got all this fantastic access, which long term is going to, be so good for the organisation. If you don't take into account the drivers for the behaviours in that department, you're not going to have much success. So it's
Sure.
just, you might have the same solution, but it's how you present it, and so how it's packaged and how it's sold to people. And that could vary across the organisation.
Sure. Yeah, it makes lots of sense to me. I think we've probably got, I don't know what episode we're up to in this podcast without really saying out loud, we need to listen to people. But that's kind of what I think you're saying, which, so you need to actually sit down and understand what is driving people and how that reflects. I know if Karl were here, he'd talk about an emergent culture, the idea of a culture that's sort of just come into being, even if you haven't formalized it. Yeah. And yeah, I think that is something that particularly if we're in a position where we're kind of being asked to demonstrate our expertise, the idea of just listening to people might, again, in terms of those kinds of perverse incentives, it might actually feel like a counterintuitive thing, like, oh, okay, I'll shut up and I'll listen to what other people already know about their own ways of working or business. Yeah.
But I think I remember in one of the podcasts we talked, I think it was you, particularly Michael, who talked about making people who work in IM or record keeping, making them be seen as people who can help you. That people will come to you because they've seen that you can help, which I think is a great idea. I've never seen it happen, but actually that's not true. That's not true,
Judi.
actually. I have. No, I have. I have seen that. But that's sort of what you're talking about there is like the stage before that. You're seeing that you can help because you're really listening and really understanding and trying to work out ways that you can support what it is they're trying to achieve. I guess sometimes that's tricky because if they are the sort of people who like to keep their stuff to themselves, you've got to find ways to kind of prise it out of their sticky little hands without making it seem like that's what you're doing.
But then you can talk about protection, security, emphasize features that are there, part of the solution, but it's which you emphasize will vary according to your, the participants, the users.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a matter of, understanding their priorities so that you can lean towards those.
Because, in organisations, there's very likely to be a multiplicity of information cultures. Yeah. So if you just think about different occupations, the finance department, accountants will have one set of practices and behaviours, and people in design, research, people like me who are just sort of like all over the place, will work quite differently.
Yeah.
And so, when you think about it like that, the idea of just one approach for an entity that's so complex is, you can see that it's going to run into problems.
Absolutely. So has your work extended to sort of how to sort of document this or what to do with the information? Like if you're trying to go and figure out the different cultures,
yeah. So
do you have thoughts on what to do with that?
We've developed some models to assist in developing an information profile of an organisation or a particular department. So we've got sort of guidance there that we've written up. And I've developed, when I say we, I'm talking about my colleague Fiorella Foscarini as well in Toronto, because we do a lot of this together. So we've developed a 3-level model of information culture that distinguishes between the factors that you can't change, the really embedded values or features of society, like the IT infrastructure in the country, the things that you can't mess with that are there. And there's a middle layer that focuses on knowledge of the legislative, perhaps standards environment, as well as understanding people's information literacy, their records literacy. And then right at the top of the model, that's the stuff that's relatively easy to change. And it's the most superficial stuff. So it's understanding what's at each level and then sort of guidance for how to proceed from there. So suggestions for how to interpret what's happening at each level. Mm-hmm. And we've distinguished some sort of 3 features that can help give that insight. And one of them is workarounds. So the things that people are doing to avoid conforming with official policies and systems, instead of just rejecting them out of hand, looking at them and to see, because sometimes they can be very innovative, and they can tell you a lot about how people really need to work.
Yeah, definitely.
So we think workarounds are a really good source of insight.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I think one aspect of that for me is that if I'm being too narrowly focused on what the outcomes are supposed to be of good information management or whatever, that workarounds tell me something about the priorities of that
Yeah,
group of users, if you like. So,
Yeah.
because it's like, well, okay, they're doing this because what matters to them is, say, how fast they can do something, just to be kind of an obvious one. And so that, yeah, is obviously then something I can work with. It's like, oh, okay, what matters to them is just that they can do something very quickly. All right. So, you know, whatever I do for them next has to accommodate that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think workarounds are quite often, as you say, very insightful. And I'm always impressed at some of the ones that people come up with, because they're just trying to do their job and get it done
yeah.
really quickly,
Uh-huh.
and shouldn't be tuttied at.
No.
They should be, I think, respected for actually trying to get the work done in the best way they can, but they haven't really got the right tools available. So yeah, I would agree with your point there. And
Yeah, like I
what
said,
about
that is a,
what I
you
was
go.
just going to say, what about working with the people at the top of an organization and helping them to understand what's needed? What's your experience there?
Well, I mean, you can get really fantastic results there short term. But I've certainly seen in organisations where, your whole approach is linked to one person at the top, everything falling apart when that one person goes. Because while they're there, they've got the influence and the authority. And you think, yeah, wow, this is really good. Everything's happening now. But if the responses to the strategy, the behaviours are all based on, that one person and their authority, and they leave, then it's all going to fall apart. So,
Sure.
middle management, sort of trying to get across the organisation and to find people who can, ways in which the influence can be ongoing and not just dependent on one person.
Mm.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes for an even bigger selling job, doesn't it? Then,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, one of my least favourite things to do. Uh, Yeah. So what are your tips for persuading and getting engagement higher up the organisation?
Finding out what the drivers are, what they're
Yeah.
going to
Right.
respond to, and likely to be financial. It's it's really really difficult. It's I mean we talk a lot about needing to have this ethnographic approach to strategies and to communication. So it's the more you understand what's valued in the organisation, the more you can use those tools. So in my faculty, for example, I've realised, so I mentioned just now that there's a couple of features that we say these reflect the information culture and you can use them. Another one is genres. And so so that could be a documentary form, it could be the way that meetings are run. That gives you insight into the culture. And in my faculty, I've realised just recently, the dominant genre that is most respected is a spreadsheet.
Oh.
Everything comes in a spreadsheet. If there's any sort of information to be collected, any documents that decisions need to be made on, a spreadsheet appears. It might not look like a spreadsheet, but that's what it is. Sometimes they're disguised so cunningly. So that tells me that if I want to get the decision that I want, I shouldn't be writing a wonderful piece of prose, a narrative to support something. There should be something spreadsheet-like there, that's very prominent, that's the main tool to be used.
That's an interesting one.
Mm.
Yeah. No, I get it.
Reminds me that did you have a Canadian writer John Ralston Saul? He wrote a whole lot on the idea that basically the medium matters more nowadays to actually get decisions made. I mean, here he very critical of kind of the state of things, so probably not one for a workplace. But he basically says the way that you present something is more important than what it actually says in order to actually kind of get your way through layers of technocrats, is how he describes it.
Sadly, yes. I mean, I'm not saying this is right or this is the best way or anything, but if you do want to get a decision made, just communicating on their terms or using the genre that people are most comfortable with can at least get people listening. So,
sure.
I think it's about us listening and making sure that other people listen to us.
Yeah. No, I guess it's not. I mean, in real life, I wouldn't say that the content doesn't matter. It's just, as you say, packaging it in a way that is most applicable for that culture. Yeah. Okay. I guess a classic one in New Zealand public sector has been the thing about A3s. That was a kind of a genre, I suppose, of information. Like,
Yes.
can you do us an A3? Like, turn anything into an A3. It's like, okay.
Yeah.
Judi, can you slap a whole ontology on an A3 for us?
I know. Well, I was asked to. I smile because one client asked me to sum it all up on an A3 that could be presented. How do you summarize that one? But we did it. I mean, I didn't think it was very good actually, but we did it.
Something happened. Yeah.
It's all the project on a page type stuff, isn't it? Which I get. I do understand that. Let's reduce it down to its simplest. But some things are really perhaps a touch too complicated to boil down to that extent.
On a page things.
Yeah, exactly.
But speaking of projects, though, I mean, Gillian, have you seen situations of people trying to kick off a kind of a project or an initiative to change the culture, change the information culture of an organisation?
Certainly.
It's a closed question.
Yeah, certainly changing organisational culture with a view to improving information management. And so the problem with those types of initiatives is that they're looking for quick answers and not taking into account there's just a little bit that can be changed, and that if you try to change behaviours without understanding the deeper values and other issues involved, then you're not going to get very far. So any sort of project plan like that, I'd be saying what you should have on there is understand the existing culture and then trying to, tease out the sort of the various layers of influence there.
So I think from what you've said, it's understanding the pervading culture, but then understanding how the culture works team by team. Yeah, that's really interesting. I certainly never thought of that. So having the chief exec or whoever address the masses is only going to do a tiny bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
But if you've got the chief exec on board, you might have the resourcing. That's
True.
So
True.
everybody has their part to play, but so get the top level on board so you get the funding. But in terms of actual long-term, actually changing behaviours, then there's a lot more work to do.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it before we started the conversation, but I'd pictured. Yeah, I realise now I did have it in my head that you'd be kind of trying to shift culture through sort of the exec, through strategy and so forth. But I
Yeah.
guess, as you're saying,
Yeah, me
given the
too.
multiplicity of cultures in one organisation, you probably do need
Yeah.
to be at that operational level of, how
Yeah.
does this manager of this team of people influence what they do, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure
Mm.
we've all been in situations where you've had people at the top saying we're going to change the culture, this is going to happen and that's going to happen, and everybody's sitting around saying, smiling politely and
Yes. Yes.
thinking their own
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah.
Just waiting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Good stuff. I'm looking at the time. We could wrap up.
We could.
I'm not sure. Did you have something else to ask, Judy?
Um,
No.
I don't think so, actually.
Okay,
Not
cool.
right now. So yeah, I found that a, a different way of thinking about it, which is really good, useful.
Good. No, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
This one. Thanks very much for coming in, and thanks everyone out there for listening. We'll be back again with another exciting episode in a couple of weeks.